A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we have a heavy one today. Daniel sent over a prompt about the science of sound, specifically the kind of sounds you never want to hear, but absolutely have to. He has been dealing with the constant sirens in Jerusalem as the conflict with Iran continues, and it got him thinking about the engineering of urgency. He mentioned setting up pushover alerts, and how that extreme alert tone is uniquely jarring, like a digital banshee designed to pierce through a deep sleep. It is a fascinating, if slightly grim, topic. Why do some sounds make our skin crawl while others we can sleep right through?
It is a great question, Corn. And by the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 1.5 Flash. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have actually been looking into the psychoacoustics of this because it is a very specific field of engineering. When you are designing an emergency alert, you are essentially trying to hack the human brain. You are looking for the exact frequency, timbre, and rhythm that the amygdala cannot ignore.
It is basically weaponized noise. I mean, if you have heard the wireless emergency alerts on a modern smartphone, they do not just sound loud, they sound wrong. They have this dissonant screeching quality. Daniel mentioned people describing them as banshees, which feels accurate. Is there actually a perfect sound to wake someone up, or is it just about being as obnoxious as possible?
There is actually a lot of data on this, though it is not as simple as just louder is better. If you just make a sound louder, people eventually tune it out, or worse, their brain incorporates it into a dream. We have all had that happen with a standard alarm clock where the beeping becomes a truck backing up in our subconscious. The foundational research here actually goes back to the 1970s. Dr. James D. Miller did some famous studies at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. He was specifically looking at what sounds would most effectively rouse soldiers from a deep sleep without causing them to freeze in a state of total panic.
That is a delicate balance. You want them awake and moving, not curled in a ball because they think the world is ending. What did Miller find?
He identified a specific sweet spot in the frequency range. He found that sounds between 500 and 2000 hertz are the most effective for waking humans. If you go lower than 500, the sound tends to be too soothing or muffled by walls. Think of the low thrum of a neighbor's bass. If you go much higher than 2000, the human ear starts to find it physically painful, which can lead to that startle response where you are awake but cognitively impaired for several seconds. You know that feeling when you jump out of bed and do not know what room you are in? That is what they are trying to avoid in a military or civil defense context.
500 to 2000 hertz. That is roughly the range of a human scream or a baby crying, right?
Evolution has primed us to be hypersensitive to that range, but Miller found that the frequency is only half the battle. The timbre, or the texture of the sound, is actually more important. A pure sine wave at 1000 hertz is annoying, like a steady whistle, but a complex tone with multiple harmonics. Think of a jagged square wave is much harder for the brain to ignore. This is why modern digital sirens do not just play one note. They use what we call a frequency sweep.
Like the rising and falling wail of the old mechanical air raid sirens?
Yes, but modernized. The old mechanical sirens, like the ones used in World War II, usually operated in the 400 to 1000 hertz range. They were limited by the physical size of the rotor. But digital systems can sweep much faster and across a wider range. The wireless emergency alerts Daniel is hearing in Israel use a very specific pattern. It is usually a combination of two tones played simultaneously, often 853 Hz and 960 Hz. When you play those together, they create a beat frequency that sounds like a harsh, vibrating dissonance. It is literally designed to be unpleasant to the human ear.
So it is not just one sound, it is two sounds fighting each other inside your head. That explains the banshee description. It feels like the sound is physically vibrating your eardrums. I have to imagine that after 78,000 sirens, which is the number Daniel cited for the current war, that sound starts to do some serious psychological damage.
It does. There is a real concern about sound-induced PTSD. When the brain associates a specific acoustic trigger with a life-threatening event tens of thousands of times, the startle reflex becomes permanent. Even a similar sounding microwave beep can trigger a full-blown shot of adrenaline. But from an engineering perspective, the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is capturing 100% of your attention in less than a second.
You mentioned the startle reflex. Is there a specific threshold where a sound goes from, hey, look at this, to run for your life?
It is usually defined by the onset rate. If a sound ramps up slowly, your brain has time to process it as a background change. But if you have a sudden increase of 20 to 40 decibels in less than 100 milliseconds, it bypasses the auditory cortex and goes straight to the amygdala. This is what pushover does with their extreme alerts. They use a very high-intensity, rapid-onset sound. It is not just the volume, it is how fast it hits that peak volume.
It is like a physical jump scare for your ears. I was looking at some of the data from the 2018 Hawaii false missile alert. That was a huge case study in how people react to these sounds. They used a 960 Hz rising tone that hit about 85 decibels on most smartphones. Even though it was a mistake, the acoustic profile was so effective that people were jumping into manholes and storm drains within seconds.
That is the power of a well-engineered alert. But there is a flip side to this, which is alarm fatigue. If you hear that banshee scream every day, your brain eventually starts to build a defense mechanism. This is a huge problem in hospitals. Nurses hear so many beeps and boops that they eventually stop hearing them emotionally. In a war zone like Jerusalem, the challenge is keeping the alert effective without making the entire population lose their minds from sleep deprivation and stress.
So, if the James Miller research from the 70s says 500 to 2000 Hz is the gold standard for waking people up, has anyone updated that for the smartphone era? Because we are not just listening to giant mechanical horns on poles anymore. We have these tiny speakers 3 inches from our faces.
There was a really interesting study in 2019 from the University of Oxford. They were looking specifically at sleep inertia. That is, that groggy, where am I feeling you get right after waking up. They found that harsh timbres, the kind of jarring, dissonant sounds we are talking about, actually reduced sleep inertia by about 23% compared to melodic sounds.
Wait, so the banshee sound actually makes you more alert once you are awake?
It forces your brain into a high arousal state instantly. If you wake up to a gentle bird chirping, your brain stays in a theta wave state for a while. You are awake, but you are not ready. If you wake up to a 900 Hz square wave sweep, your brain skips the pleasantries and goes straight to beta waves. You are cognitively on much faster. In a situation where you have 90 seconds to get to a shelter, that 23% reduction in grogginess is the difference between life and death.
I guess that makes sense, even if it sounds miserable. But how does that work in practice for someone who is a heavy sleeper? Does the brain eventually just say no thanks to the square wave if it's exhausted enough?
That's where the temporal pattern comes in. If it was just a constant drone, the brain would eventually habituate. That's why these alerts use burst patterns on for half a second, off for half a second. It creates a constant state of retriggering. Every time the sound stops and starts, the brain has to reevaluate the threat. It's like someone poking you in the shoulder repeatedly versus just resting their hand there.
It's relentless. I wonder about the cultural differences, though. Do different countries use different flavors of jarring? I remember hearing that Japanese earthquake alerts sound very different from American or European sirens.
They do. Japan's J-alert system uses a series of high-frequency bell-like chirps. It is still very urgent, but it is less of a wail and more of a staccato. In the West, we tend to favor the long wail because it mimics the mechanical sirens of the Cold War. There is a certain amount of acoustic branding involved. You want the sound to be recognizable as the emergency sound. If you change the sound of a fire alarm to a high-pitched pop song, people would just be confused.
Why is the building playing Taylor Swift at 90 decibels? Yeah, I see the problem. But let's talk about the hardware for a second. These smartphones are tiny. How are they getting that much punch out of a speaker the size of a pea?
It is all about resonance and compression. Engineers at companies like Apple and Samsung spend thousands of hours optimizing the internal cavity of the phone to resonate at those specific emergency frequencies. They can actually push those tiny speakers to produce upwards of 100 or even 110 decibels at close range. To give you some perspective, a jackhammer at 50 feet is about 95 decibels. These phones are literally louder than heavy machinery if they are sitting on your nightstand.
That is wild. I mean, I have definitely felt my phone vibrate off a table during a weather alert. Is the vibration part of the jarring engineering, or is that just a byproduct?
No, the haptics are deeply integrated. There is a lot of research into multimodal alerts. The idea is that if you are in a deep sleep, sound might not be enough, especially if you have hearing loss or you are wearing earplugs. But a specific, irregular vibration pattern, something that does not feel like a text message, can trigger the somatosensory system. It is a backup for the ears.
It is amazing how much thought goes into making us feel terrible. I mean, that is essentially what this is. It is the dark art of discomfort. You mentioned the UK emergency alert test from 2023. I remember that because people were genuinely shocked by how loud it was, even on phones that were set to silent.
That is the critical alert bypass. It is a layer of the operating system that ignores your volume settings. And that test was a perfect example of public reaction to these engineered sounds. People described it as terrifying and disturbing, but from a public safety standpoint, it was a success. They reached over 90% of the population, and almost everyone acknowledged that it was impossible to ignore.
So, let's look at the second order effects. If you're Daniel, and you are hearing this banshee sound multiple times a night for weeks on end, what happens to the effectiveness? Does the jarring quality eventually wear off?
This is where we get into the cry wolf problem, or more accurately, sensitization. For some people, the sound becomes more effective because the brain is constantly on edge, waiting for it. This is called hypervigilance. For others, they experience habituation, where the brain starts to filter it out as background noise to protect itself. This is why some modern systems are looking at randomized alert tones. If the sound changes slightly every time, the brain cannot habituate to it.
That sounds even worse. Which terrifying sound will I wake up to tonight? It is like a horror movie soundtrack on shuffle. But I guess if the goal is to keep people alive, you do what you have to do. What about the 3-second rule you were telling me about earlier?
This is a key principle in emergency management. An effective alert must convey 3 things within the first 3 seconds: urgency, identity, and direction. The urgency comes from the frequency and volume. The identity comes from the specific brand of the sound. You know it is an emergency, not a text, and the direction usually comes from the voice or text that follows. If a sound takes 10 seconds to get your attention, it has already failed.
That is why they do not use music. Music has a slow build-up. You need that square wave hit right out of the gate. I was actually thinking about the engineering of pagers. Daniel mentioned them, and they are still used by emergency services because they are so reliable. Those old pager tones. The 527 Hz and 941 Hz chirps were specifically designed to cut through the noise of a busy office or a hospital.
Pagers are great because they are single-purpose devices. When a pager goes off, you know exactly what it means. Smartphones are multi-purpose, which makes the job of the emergency alert much harder. It has to distinguish itself from the thousands of other notifications you get every day. That is why the banshee sound is so extreme. It has to be the apex predator of your notification tray.
The apex predator of your notification tray. I like that. It is the T-Rex of sounds. It eats all the other little pings and dings for breakfast. But wait, what about the psychological toll of that identity part? If you associate that specific T-Rex sound with mortal danger, does it ever become unusable for anything else?
In fact, there's a fun fact about the tritone, the musical interval of an augmented fourth. Historically, it was called the diabolus in musica, or the devil in music. It's naturally dissonant and creates a feeling of unresolved tension. Modern sirens often use intervals close to the tritone because humans are biologically hardwired to want that tension to resolve. Since the siren never resolves, your brain stays in a state of high anxiety until the sound stops. We've essentially taken a medieval musical taboo and turned it into a life-saving tool.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. We're literally using the devil's interval to tell people to get to a bomb shelter. So, if someone is listening to this and they want to make sure their own systems are actually effective, maybe they are a developer or just someone who wants to be prepared, what is the takeaway?
Well, the first thing is to audit your critical alert settings. Most people do not realize that on iOS and Android, you have to manually grant permission for certain apps to bypass the silent switch. If you are using a security app or a weather app, make sure that is toggled on.
And if you are choosing a sound for a custom alert, like Daniel did with pushover, what should you look for?
Aim for that Miller range, 800 to 1200 Hz. Look for sounds with a staccato or sawtooth waveform rather than a smooth sine wave. A sawtooth wave looks like the teeth of a saw on an oscilloscope. It has very sharp peaks and valleys, which creates that buzzing or tearing quality in the air. And most importantly, look for something with a rapid onset. You want the sound to hit its peak volume instantly. If it fades in, it is not an emergency alert. It is a wake-up call for a spa.
Emergency spa? Sounds like a very confusing business model. Quick, get in the sauna. We have 90 seconds. But in all seriousness, the effectiveness of these sounds really comes down to their ability to trigger that primal fear. It is a reminder that, despite all our technology, we are still just biological machines with a panic button that can be pressed by a few specific frequencies.
It is a sobering thought, especially given what Daniel is going through. In a war zone, those frequencies are being used to save lives, but they are also a constant reminder of the threat. The engineering is perfect, but the human cost is high. I saw a report that since the start of the war, sirens have sounded over 78,000 times across Israel. If you figure each siren lasts at least 60 to 90 seconds, that's thousands of hours of high-intensity acoustic stress. That is a staggering amount of high-decibel stress for a population to absorb.
It really puts things in perspective. We complain about our phone's alarm being annoying, but we are not relying on it to dodge missiles. I wonder, as we move forward, if we will see more personalized alerts. I mean, with AI, could we tailor a sound specifically for your brain's wake-up profile?
That is actually an area of active research. Some people respond better to low frequencies, others to high. We could theoretically have a system that tests your response time to different tones and then builds a custom emergency profile for you. But the downside is the identity problem we talked about. If everyone has a different sounding emergency alert, we lose that collective understanding of this sound means danger.
Right. If my danger sound is a high-pitched whistle and yours is a low-frequency hum, we might not realize there is a problem if we are in the same room. There is a lot to be said for the universal banshee. It is a shared language of get to safety now.
And that is why the standards, like the NFPA 72 fire alarm standards, are so rigid. They require a minimum of 75 decibels at 3 feet in any sleeping area. But civil defense alerts often push 90 or even 100. They are not asking for your attention, they are demanding it.
How does that work for people with hearing impairments, though? If the science is so focused on these specific hertz ranges, are we leaving people behind?
That's a critical point. For the hearing impaired, the science of sound shifts to the science of light and touch. High-intensity strobe lights flashing at a rate of 1 to 3 Hz are the visual equivalent of that jarring square wave. The frequency of the flash is timed to be different from the natural rhythms of the heart or brain to prevent seizures while still being impossible to ignore. It's the same engineering philosophy. Find the rhythm the brain can't tune out.
It is the ultimate dark art. You are using science to create something that people hate, because hating it is what keeps them alive. It is a weird paradox. I think we have covered a lot of ground here, from the military research of the 70s to the smartphone engineering of today.
It is a deep topic, and it is one of those things where the more you know about the engineering, the more you appreciate and maybe fear the devices in your pocket. These are not just communication tools, they are sophisticated psychological triggers.
Well, I for one am going to go change my morning alarm to something slightly less banshee-like after this. I don't think I need a 23% reduction in sleep inertia if it means I start every day thinking I'm being invaded by Iran.
Fair enough. Although, if you keep hitting the snooze button, I might have to come over and play some 900 hertz square waves for you.
Don't you dare. I will hide your hay.
That is a low blow, Corn. A low blow.
Anyway, this has been a fascinating look into a very intense topic. Daniel, thank you for the prompt. We are thinking of you and Hannah and little Ezra. Stay safe out there.
Yes, stay safe. And thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running.
And big thanks to Modell for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do it without them.
If you found this dive into the acoustics of urgency interesting, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the show find its way to more people who are into this kind of weird technical stuff.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the RSS feed and all our previous episodes. We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified when new episodes drop. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
See you in the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and fall.